Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining our third session for the day. And I am sad on one level, but I'm delighted on another level regarding our speakers for this afternoon. We had originally booked Dr. Ariella Helfgott to speak to us this afternoon from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. She's the Director of Strategic Foresight. But Ariella, unfortunately, due to health reasons, hasn't been able to join us today, so we wish her a speedy recovery. And at literally the last minute, we have had two wonderful people chip in to actually give a talk to us. And I can actually speak at first hand about how wonderful they are, because it has been my privilege to work with them both as part of the organising committee for today's event. As I mentioned, it's an event between Blackwood Uniting Church, Conservation Council of South Australia, 20 metre trees, sustainable communities, Parents for Climate Action. And Tom Morrison, one of our speakers this afternoon, is indeed the founder of 20 metre trees Facebook page, which seeks to raise awareness of the importance of trees in our urban environment. Tom has been working in the area of law reform for a number of years. Over the past 3 years, he's been a lead author on a number of highly influential reports prepared in partnership with Conservation SA, and more about Joanna and her involvement in a moment, and other tree advocacy organisations. His work has compared tree regulations in South Australia to the rest of the country, seeking to actually bring things into alignment with better legislation across the board. Tom was the 2022 winner of the Jill Hudson Award for Environmental Protection from the State Environment Awards, and has recently been elected to Mitcham Council to represent the Park Ward. Joanna Wells, who will be co-presenting with Tom, is with the Conservation Council of SA and is also recently elected to the City of Mitcham as a councillor, so we congratulate them both. Joanna has worked in education for 30 years and now works with the Conservation Council and the National Trust in advocacy work. With a focus on natural and built heritage seen through the lens of climate change, she has worked to prevent inappropriate roadworks, save the Waite Gatehouse, keep Ayers House publicly accessible, and roll out the Climate Action Now campaign across Adelaide. So if you've seen those yellow posters, and boy, we've seen a lot around here, that's Joanna and the Conservation Council. Joanna firmly believes that together we can, and indeed we should, change the world. I'm delighted to welcome Tom and Joanna. Thank you so much for presenting to us today.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I feel like we're sort of, very poor replacements for Ariella Helfgott, because I've been to a couple of things that she's done, and she is amazing. So I was actually really disappointed when she couldn't make it, but Tom and I are both obviously very happy for that. So I just thought before we...
Joanna, I'm just thinking maybe the microphone might be a good idea, wherever it is. Just have it turned on. Yep.
We're going? Yes.
Yep.
So just before we start, I thought it might be worth getting quick hands up in terms of people's knowledge about tree protections and law reform in that area. Hands up if you feel like you know a reasonable amount about it. Is there anyone? Yeah. The rest of you feel like, yeah, you're concerned about it, but you're not really sure what to do. Would that be a fair assessment?
I know one or two things.
One or two things? Okay, great. All right. So over the last 3 years, Tom and I have worked voluntarily with the Conservation Council and numbers of other people as a group working to see changes to our tree protections. So we started off, it was a result of the Mount Barker trees fiasco. Does everyone know what I'm talking about when I say the Mount Barker trees? No. So the Mount Barker Council some 20 or so years ago actually purchased a greenfield site, and the aim of that was that at some point down the track it would be developed and it would become a sports stadium. So as part of that development process, the design had a driveway coming in off the road, obviously, and that driveway went straight through the path of 4 beautiful remnant, so pre-European settlement, river red gums. Apparently they couldn't move it because the speed zone on that particular stretch of road was 80, so that's where the driveway apparently had to go. Since then it's been changed down to 60, and so the driveway could actually have been moved. But what the net result of that was that 3 of these 4 river reds were literally cut off at a metre above the ground, and permission was given to do that by the Native Vegetation Council. The council arborist was in the unenviable position of having to work out what to do with these trees. So couldn't save them, but obviously didn't want to lose the habitat value that they offered. So the decision was made to basically, in inverted commas, replant them. So they dug 3 big holes. They didn't have any roots, obviously, so they were always going to die. And they literally dropped them using a crane, each into their own hole. And this hit the media because Sophie Thompson just happens to live down the road, and she missed the consultation. She was oblivious. She drove past one day and just about crashed her car when she saw what was going on. Stopped and asked the guys there who were doing the tree lopping, and they said, oh, we're moving them into those holes. And she said, why are you doing that? And they said, to provide habitat. Mm-hmm. So that hit the media, and out of that there was a meeting that was being held. This group was born. So we knew that things were pretty dire, but we didn't know quite how bad they were. So we thought we need to actually find out what we're dealing with here. So that was our first report, the one down the bottom, what's happening to Adelaide's trees. And then we went on to have a look at the second one, the call to action report. So that's a really comprehensive report. There are copies of it available on the table that we've got out the front there. It's also available on the Con Council website. And what we were really keen to do with that was to work with industry professionals and to come up with a series of changes that could actually effectively be made and that were achievable. So we consulted with private industry arborists, we consulted with council arborists, planners, environmental lawyers, you name it. We didn't want to be able to be easily dismissed as a bunch of tree-hugging hippies who were off in la-la land with these really unrealistic things that they were asking in terms of reform of the tree laws. So that's actually turned out to be a really influential report. And off the back of that, we knew that our tree laws were pretty poor compared with what they have interstate, but we didn't know quite how bad. And we wanted to really be able to push hard and say, come on, we need to actually do better and make these changes. So Tom and I sat down and looked at 39 councils interstate, because in the majority of jurisdictions interstate, it's actually not a state set thing, the laws. They're actually set by the local councils. So we looked at 39 of these and produced the comparison report. And our overwhelming conclusion with that was that our tree laws are actually really, really bad. Pretty well everyone who was doing it interstate was doing it much better than what we were doing in terms of protecting trees on private land. So that report went out, and people were quite worried, I guess, by the results of it. The State Planning Commission must have thought we'd cherry-picked the councils that we used, because off the back of that report, they actually commissioned Adelaide Uni to do a similar report. So Adelaide Uni went out, and this is a really good example of why you don't ask the question unless you know what the answer is. Adelaide Uni went out, and they looked at 101 council areas interstate. They found that everything that we had said was actually correct for all of those 101 councils. So that was really great because it really backed the work that we had done. And they also went further in terms of saying what we should be asking for. So that was great. And out of that came the promise from Labor in the lead up to the state election that they would actually meet that best practice that we're seeing interstate and improve our tree laws so that that was matched. So that was fantastic.
Have they done that?
They haven't done it. That's a very good question. And by the way, are you happy to take questions as we go? Yeah, really happy to take questions from the floor as we head through. Yes, they haven't done it yet, but they're actually in the process of doing it. So there were some 14,000 people who signed a petition about the planning and design code when that was coming out, and that forced it to the Legislative Review Committee. That committee has put out a report, and one of the things that was recommended through that report that was asked for in the petition was a review of the planning and design code. So that's currently underway. You have until the 16th of December to put a submission in, and we'll give you some more information on that later. And included in that review of the planning and design code specifically are tree laws. So there are some discussion papers that have been made available. The expert panel asked some 16 questions about tree laws, and they're really, really keen to find out the changes that people want to see. We spoke at a meeting the other day, and we didn't realise that Nick Champion's chief advisor was going to be there. And we had a chat with her afterwards, and she said literally every email that is being sent into the expert review panel is being automatically forwarded on to her in their office. It's taking her a while, obviously, because there are a lot of them, but she's actually reading every single one of them. And she really stressed to people at that meeting the importance of actually telling them what you think. It doesn't have to be a formally written submission. It can simply be 3 dot points in an email. But please take the opportunity to actually have that input, because that will then be reported back on, and there should, in theory, be recommendations. That's a little bit of a blurry area at the moment, but we're hoping that we'll see the changes that we need to see, and that all the evidence is telling us that we need to see. Can we? Sorry. Is that okay, Michael? I'm just having a bad shit with that.
This is not
That's
working
not
either,
working
Tim.
either. Great to have the support of our mayor in the back row, giggling. Thank you, Worship.
Is there a template we can use to send an email through?
Yes, there is, and we'll actually give you some further information about that. Yeah. All right, so.
Just a little bit of to sort of round out exactly where we're going with this. So as Joanna's just highlighted, there is a planning review on at the moment in the state government, and I guess what we're going to run through today is a list of where we see the top sort of 10 most important areas to try and push for change are, which has sort of been the work that we've done in reports which have been written in collaboration with organisations like TreeNet, the National Trust of South Australia, Trees for Life, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation, that sort of stuff. So we haven't sort of just pulled these ideas out of anywhere in particular. What we've always focused on with regards to the trees campaign is really preventing the unnecessary loss of trees. So late 1990s, South Australia introduced protections for regulated and significant trees here in South Australia. So a regulated tree has a trunk circumference of 2 metres or more, measured 1 metre above the ground. And their intention, as I said, was to prevent the unnecessary loss of those trees, but not stop development. And the second part of that's really quite important in this. It doesn't really matter whether you like trees or you hate them. The current system is broken to a large extent, and I'll run through a couple of examples in this presentation as to why that's the case. And basically, it's really important at the end of the day that we have a system which works for councils and local residents, development groups, and that it all sort of cohesively fits into the new planning system which we have here, which sort of rolled out by the state government in March of last year. And as Joanna highlighted, we are quite significantly behind our interstate counterparts in this area, and we'll highlight some of the reasons why that's the case going forward. What happened basically is that late 1990s we had our first lot of protections for regulated trees. In 2011 the state government changed a lot of those regulations based off some feedback they had and a whole pile of different reasons. And in conjunction as part of that they introduced to protections for large trees a number of different exemptions. Now those exemptions were put in for some reasons which were quite logical, even if they weren't that well thought out. And what that has really resulted in has been a lot of the unnecessary loss of our large trees. So we have regulated significant trees here in South Australia. So regulated said is 2 metres, measured 1 metre above the ground in trunk circumference. A significant tree has a trunk circumference of 3 metres, measured 1 metre above the ground. And then on top of that, you also have protections for native vegetation. And for the purpose of this, we're going to sort of keep on the 2 metre trunk circumference for a large native tree. And in the protections for those trees, there are a large number of exemptions which have been introduced, which we'll cover through in a little bit of detail. The first one which we'll want to take a look at is the 10 metre rule here in South Australia. So across metropolitan Adelaide, any tree, a large tree, within 10 metres of a building, a dwelling can be removed, regardless of whether or not it's classified as regulated, unless it's a eucalypt of any species or a willow myrtle. Now, nobody knows why willow myrtles are included in that. It's one of the oddities of our planning system, but willow myrtles are protected trees here in South Australia. What that 10 metre rule has sort of continued allowed as we have sort of smaller block sizes and urban densification is the wholesale clearing of our blocks from corner to corner. And it doesn't really matter whether the trees could remain in the new housing which is going to be built there, the blocks are just cleared corner to corner. We have here, this tree was down in sort of Westbourne Parkway in Mitcham, and it was, at the time that this picture was taken, it was a protected tree. However, the developer had bought the block of land behind this tree and they had demolished the house. The tree was now further than 10 metres away from the dwelling on the block behind it, which was being redeveloped. So the tree was protected. At that point in time, when the footings for the new house were being done, along with the drainage, they went through the root zone of that tree. Now, that is a tree damaging activity and that can be sort of punishable up to $120,000 worth of fines. That severely compromised this tree to the extent that it had to be taken out. What happened though is they built the new dwellings on the block of land behind it. The tree was now no longer further than 10 metres from the dwelling, and therefore they were able to remove it without having any sort of penalties and repercussions associated with it. And so that's one of these really interesting scenarios where you have a system where nobody's really bothered. So the homeowner of this block here actually had to pay for the tree removal, despite the fact that it was the developer on the block of land behind it who would cause the issues with it. And those sorts of things get really, really very messy very quickly in this situation. Next slide. If you live locally up here, probably the exemption which has been most damaging to see a significant amount of tree loss is the 20 metre rule. And the 20 metre rule was introduced in 2011 to allow people to enact their bushfire action plans, which is really important. However, at the time it was introduced, the CFS actually opposed the introduction of this rule, and they did so for a number of different reasons. So, in the situation of bushfires, large trees, when they're sort of strategically placed around a block, can be really, really beneficial in preventing an ember attack from hitting the roof of your house. They slow down wind speeds, which will cause the fire to move quicker, and they will also sort of drop radiant heat, and that's where the CFS has been quite concerned on, because what you've seen locally in particular is people take out large trees on their block of land. They have then planted up the understory around their house because they'd still like a little bit of greenery, a little bit of connection to their garden and everything else. That understory, in a sense of a bushfire, is what is basically called as being fine fuels. And fine fuels are essentially what power the bushfire and give a lot of that fuel load to it rather than necessarily the large trees. So this suburb here is Glenouta, this is where I grew up. It's the small little red dots are each individual dwelling, and then the larger red circles are 20 metres around every dwelling. And as you can see, when those rules are applied to the sort of peri-urban areas that we live in up here, or Flagstaff Hill and that sort of stuff, it basically includes everything potentially in the suburb unless you've got a council reserve. And that's really, really problematic because you can't ever see that as being the original intention of this exemption. And it's the same with the 10 metre rule and the stuff under the native veg. While those exemptions might have been put in place for a particular reason, at the end of the day, they're not being used for that intended reason. So very few people up here are taking out trees because they're bushfires. It might be because they make a mess, they drop leaves and all those sorts of things. Despite the fact there are a lot of different ways to sort of manage that sort of stuff, which is just not being done when there's no sorts of checks and balances in place to make sure that the reason why the exemption was introduced is what it's being used for.
Okay, we would like to see the definition of a protected tree changed. As Tom said, a metre off the ground, 2 metres around it's protected, and 3 metres is significant. But that's a really blunt instrument because there are huge numbers of trees that, because they are slow growing, because of the species and so on, never actually get to that size. So what that means is that we're actually missing a whole, not catching a whole lot of trees. Interstate, they do a lot better. So we would like to see the changes made so that if the trunk circumference is 50 centimetres or more, measured a metre off the ground, or if it has a height of 6 metres or more, or a canopy of over 9 square metres, we would like to see those trees protected. There are some councils interstate that protect trees with a 5 centimetre circumference. That's nothing, it's tiny. What this would do would be really important. It would not only protect those big old trees that the vast majority of us really value when we see them in the landscape, it would also protect the next generation of our urban forest. So with the protections as they stand, not only is it possible to remove big old trees, but it's also possible to take out a whole lot of smaller stuff. So we want to see that coming through, so that as we have natural attrition, when trees get older, we've got those younger trees coming through.
This one here is quite important, more from a political perspective here in South Australia. As Joanna highlighted earlier, we are the only state in the country where the protection of trees and vegetation is not delegated to the local council to decide. It is set here by the state government. Now, that means that we have a one-size-fits-all policy for South Australia when it comes to tree protections. What works up here should work for Unley, should work for Burnside, should work for Port Adelaide Enfield, and you get the idea. And realistically, that it doesn't, because we've got very different types of vegetation, very different box sizes, very different development patterns, and very different community expectations. Now, here in South Australia, you're never going to be able to give council sort of control over what's protected in this space, because in March last year, the state government took control of the planning code. Seeing that's a relatively new step, they're certainly not going to let councils have too much of a say over this. However, our planning system here is somewhat similar to what they use in Victoria. And since the late 1990s in Victoria, they've had vegetation overlays put into their planning system. And that allows the councils here, if we adopted something similar, to run through what is currently called a code amendment process, which is what you have to do here in South Australia if you want to change the zoning or particular box sizes for parcels of land and areas. What happens is the council would go out to the local community and see whether or not they are interested in providing greater protection to trees and vegetation in their local area. If the community says yes, they will then run through the code amendment process, and they'll get permission from the state government to be able to change the rules and the regulations around it. And the council's also got to be willing to support that greater level of protection, which is something which is really important here. So what we think could be done here in South Australia is something very similar to these code overlays and the vegetation overlays in Victoria, where the state government sets essentially a minimum baseline for protected trees across the state. And if councils want to go further in conjunction with the community, then that's what they are allowed to do. But they have to get permission from the community to put that in place, which is really important for this situation. I talked a little bit just before about the 20 metre rule for the bushfire stuff here in sort of medium to high bushfire prone areas. And while we would like to see that blanket exemption removed, because blanket exemptions can be used for all sorts of things, we would like to replace it with a different system here. For the past 11 months, Joanna and I have been working on a new report, a bushfire report, in conjunction with feedback from both the CFS and from the Native Vegetation Council here in South Australia. And what we'd like to see is that the level of trees and vegetation that can be cleared should be based off your bushfire attack level. Now, for those who don't know what a bushfire attack level is, if you are going to do a development in a high bushfire zone in the Adelaide Hills, you have to go out to the CFS and they will come out and perform a bushfire attack level assessment. Those assessments then sort of determine to what standards you have to build your house to, whether you need to include sprinklers, you can't have wooden window frames, that sort of stuff. What that also allows, though, and they take into account when they're doing those assessments, the topography of the site, the vegetation around it, the maintenance, the vegetation around it, and those sorts of factors. And so for the first time ever, you have the potential to have a holistic approach to looking at sort of bushfire mitigation, risk mitigation in areas like the Adelaide Hills when it comes to sort of dealing with vegetation management, and also the ability to inform homeowners over what is a bushfire risk and what is not a bushfire risk, and that's a really important aspect of this. And it doesn't just have to stop there. You could also then provide advice to homeowners on what they could do to their existing house. A number of years ago now, over in WA, they had some very bad bushfires. And one of the leading causes of property loss in those bushfires were homeowners who had evaporative air conditioners. Bushfire was occurring, you have a lot of embers going around. The embers got into the pads around the evaporative air conditioners, and those houses burnt from the roof downwards. And yet we still allow people locally to be building houses in high bushfire areas with evaporative air conditioners attached to them.
All right. Our next recommendation is that pruning occurs via the Australian standard. So at the moment, you can actually prune up to 30% of a regulated or significant tree, so both protected, without council approval. So what this means is there's no time frame on the 30%. So I could prune 30% off my regulated or significant tree this year without any need for approval. And then 6 months from now, I could go back and I could prune off another 30%. So we're getting considerably less canopy all the time. 6 months after that, another 30. And before you know it, I've got a tree that's really badly balanced and is potentially dangerous. And gosh, it needs to come out because we can't live with that level of danger. So what we're seeing is this is being abused. So death by 1,000 cuts for the tree. The Australian standard, the advantage of pruning to that is that one of the really clear things in it is there's no minimum or maximum amount. So some trees can cope with 50% of their canopy being removed. Other trees, 10% is too much. But the key thing in that standard is that it can't have a detrimental impact on the health of the tree. So this is a game changer if we can get this through.
One thing which is sort of, there's a public perception here in South Australia, some reasons rightly and some reasons wrongly, but getting removal of a protected tree is a very difficult and drawn out process, and to a large extent the councils don't help with that. And when you have the protections for trees like willow and myrtles, people think that every single tree is protected. As Joanna highlighted earlier, we do have some of the, if not the weakest tree protections here in Australia, and that's not us saying that. That is a report done by the University of Adelaide. The state government's recognised it. Everybody's very well aware of that. What we need to see, though, is a quicker approval and assessment process in relation to if you would like a tree to be removed. Currently here in South Australia, there's no requirements to be able to call yourself an arborist. If you have a chainsaw, you're an arborist. Okay? It's really that simple. What we would like to see, though, is councils being able to encourage homeowners, if they would like the tree to be removed, to contact an actual arborist who have got associated qualifications in regards to that. And that will then allow for a quicker approval process. So ideally, councils would have a list basically of pre-approved arborists who they've done the vetting process on, they're aware of their qualifications. The councils can provide that list to the homeowner. If the homeowner contacts one of those arborists, they get a report from that arborist. That will fly through council's processes much quicker because a lot of that checking's done. At the moment, if you go and get an arborist report for your tree and the council doesn't particularly like the arborist that you've chosen, they will then go out and get a secondary arborist opinion on your tree currently as it stands. So there's a lot of duplication around that process, and as a result it's drawn out from a time perspective, and it's also costly for everybody involved. As a final sort of extent to that, we would really like to see that if the arborist has said the tree can go, they are not also allowed to remove the tree. There is a massive conflict of interest currently occurring where the arborist will recommend that the tree should be removed and then also remove the tree. It's a bit like asking a hairdresser in some situations if you need a haircut. The answer is yes, you do need a haircut. So that then sort of removes that conflict of interest and opens it up to a much better system.
All right, this may come as a shock to some of you, but the government, a couple of government departments, actually have exemptions in terms of protecting trees. So two really key departments are DIT and DECT. Renewal SA is the other one with an exemption. And what this means is that they don't need to get planning approval in order to remove trees. So the Golden Grove Road upgrade was a really, really good illustration of how badly this works. Is anyone in the room familiar with it? I saw a couple of nods. No? Okay. So I'll just give you a brief rundown. So there was a section of Golden Grove Road that was upgraded between Yatala Vale Road and One Tree Hill Road. That was phase one of a three-phase process. And at community consultation, the local community asked how many trees would be removed in order to do this. It was to make safe an intersection that was actually really quite dangerous. So they wanted to put a big roundabout at this particular intersection. And they accepted that it needed to be upgraded. What they were concerned about was the number of trees that potentially might go. And when they asked the question of DIT at the community consultation, DIT's response was a few. A few turned out to be 180, mostly remnant river red gums. Now we don't have one of the photos in the slideshow, but if I were to show you a photo of one of the trees that went, half of you would probably weep. I went out with some friends and we measured and took photos because we knew that there were trees going, but we didn't know which trees would be going. So we wanted to actually document it. And we did a run of this entire stretch that was being done and looked at trees as we went. And a couple of my friends have been out there previously and taken some photos. And they said, oh yeah, we'll come back and do that one. I think that'll be a good one. And as we drove past on the road, I thought, it doesn't really look that big. But when we actually came back and stopped and parked and went across with our tape measure and cameras and whatever, it turned out to be 8.4 metres around. That's massive. It took 4 of us wandering around with the tape measure to get back to where we'd started. When we went back a week later, that tree was gone. It's heartbreaking. And it was actually really healthy. So that was a remnant river red gum, hundreds of years old. To add insult to injury, the road project, that stretch of road is still only one lane both ways. They've redone the cycle path so that it's dead straight and boring. They've redone the walking trail so that it's dead straight and boring. And the bus stop that comes in off the road, so the bus isn't parked on the road picking people up, that they put in where they took that 8.4 metre tree out, could just have gone 5 metres that way and the tree could have remained. So the consequences of these exemptions are that we're seeing, from the DIC point of view, really poor, lazy planning. They like straight lines, they're boring. Straight lines, I mean, not the DIC people. Straight lines are boring. There's lots of evidence that it's actually better for us to have things that curve and don't always go in a straight line. So here we are with this exemption and we're seeing really lazy planning outcomes from DIP. They don't even have to keep a record of how many trees go. So if you wanted to do the maths and find out, it's impossible. So that was one road project and that was phase 1 of 3. So that's a killer. On a decked school site or a kindergarten site where it's publicly run, so the minister has responsibility for the site, if a branch comes down off a tree on the corner of the oval, what mostly happens is the emotive fear response. Oh my goodness, this is really dangerous. What if the kid gets killed? And clearly we don't want to see kids being killed by gum tree branches. However, the response that should be occurring is to get an arborist in and prune it to make it safe. The automatic response shouldn't be removal of the tree. Because if you actually run through a risk assessment for the tree, it is very difficult to get a high risk as your rating. And there are so many things that you can do to make it safe. So clearly you don't have kids playing under the tree on a 45-degree day or when it's really super windy, and that's when the tree is more likely to drop a branch. And you have to make sure you've got a good regime in place in terms of watering and so on. So it's definitely something that we can get around. And the other thing, the key thing about that for me, is that government would be seen to lead by example. And this is a really important thing. At the moment, the hoops that you and I have to jump through if we want to remove a tree, although it's hard to believe after what Tom's been saying, but they are actually there and they're relatively substantial. But there's nothing for government. So that's a key change that we'd like to see, and that's the next.
When we transitioned across to the new state planning code in March of last year, the state government and the planning commission are really, really pleased about the fact that we've got something new. The urban tree canopy overlay has been introduced, which means that if you're building a new house, you have to put a tree in. It doesn't sound like much, but it's 100% improvement on what was originally there for most council codes, so you have essentially one tree per new dwelling. When that was originally proposed, particularly people got very, very antsy about it, very, very concerned about the requirement to plant one tree. And so the State Planning Commission went out and got a cost-benefit analysis done as to whether or not it was worthwhile planting one tree per new dwelling. Unsurprisingly, the answer was yes, it is. The benefits are there for it. What they did, though, is they opened the door potentially that if you have a particular soil type, 3 specific soil types, or you're in 3 specific zonings, typically the higher density ones, and therefore the ones that you probably actually need the trees in to prevent urban heat islands, instead of planting a tree, you can pay into an offset fund. Now, there are 3 types of trees under this. There is a small tree where you pay $300, there's a medium tree where you pay $600, and there's a large tree where you pay $1,200. And what tree you've got to plant sort of depends on the size of your block of land associated with it. When that was introduced, they never looked at what percentage of metropolitan Adelaide had one of those 3 soil types in it. Now is it about 70-75%? Yep. The City of Mitcham thankfully did the numbers, and it's about 75% of the City of Mitcham has one of those 3 soil types. They're pretty common soil types for the entirety of metropolitan Adelaide, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to input these offset funds for a $300 tree or a $600 tree or a $1,200 tree, because that then requires the councils to plant a replacement tree for you. The average cost to council to planting a street tree and maintaining it for 3 years is roughly $3,000. So if you pay your $300 into the offset fund and it's costing council $3,000 to plant a replacement tree for you instead, there's a $2,700 difference there which somebody's got to sort of cough up. So the question to councils is do they not plant all of the trees, or do they pass the cost on to you anyway of planting the trees instead? What's been really, really interesting though is that so far in the introduction of the code itself, very, very few people have paid money into the offset fund. Right? And that's good news because you don't really want people paying into the offset fund. The bad news is nobody checks to see whether the tree's ever been planted and whether or not the tree ever survives. So you can avoid paying your $300 and say you planted a tree and sort of just run from there. What we'd really like to see though is that if the offset scheme is to remain, then the fees should essentially match the cost that is incurred on councils to planting the trees in the first place, because it's just logical. The cost-benefit analysis that the State Planning Commission done actually put the cost of an unregulated sized tree, so smaller than 2 metres in trunk circumference, at over $3,000 a tree. So they've actually come up with that number themselves, but they're only making people pay up to $1,200. And the final thing is we'd really like to see the number or the size of the trees increased under the planning code. So if you're doing a house renovation currently, the urban tree canopy overlay doesn't kick into that. It's only applying if you're doing a new dwelling. A lot of the suburbs throughout Adelaide, the more established ones, like for example over in Walkerville Council, a lot of the tree loss is occurring is when people are doing renovations or redevelopments of their places, but there's no requirement to plant a tree.
Can I ask a question here? I live in Grange, so it's a long way from here. What I've noticed is that people are removing trees like crazy in their properties, and they're planting these pissy little things that are never going to amount to anything, and they're just sort of ornamental really and quite useless in my opinion. Is there anything in here that sort of specifies, you know, because to me I think it's just pretty much a waste of time planting those sorts of trees.
Yes and no is the answer. So they do have some specific requirements around what size a tree it should be, but not so much the species yet. I think that'll end up coming. One of the issues they've got is the availability of sort of large established trees at this point in time. There was actually a shortage here in South Australia. So there's been a number of councils this year who haven't been able to fill their tree planting requirements because there aren't enough trees of that size, and it takes a number of years to sort of get that to flow through the system. So councils across Metropolitan Adelaide have really stepped up their street tree planting as a result of the loss on private land. And that's created a bit of a shortage. Green Adelaide, and if you come out and see where Joanna and I are out there, we've got some of their garden guides. They've released some sort of useful information to homeowners in terms of where they could plant the trees and the type of species that they could plant. And I wouldn't be surprised if that then starts carrying over to the planning code itself at a later date and time. We have here in South Australia, if you get permission to remove a protected tree, you don't have to pay a lot of money. You have two options here. If you get to remove a regulated tree, you can either plant 2 replacement trees, or if you can't plant those replacement trees, because they have to be further than 10 metres from your dwelling, you can pay $156 for each tree not planted. Now, $156 doesn't even get close to sort of conveying the value of those trees, because trees, in terms of the value that they provide to us, can be worth sort of tens of thousands of dollars in the overall scheme of things. We would really like to see this start getting, I guess, sort of matching the value of the trees. And the state government's very, very aware of it, because realistically, if it's always cheaper to remove the tree, that's always the easy option which is taken, okay? So we'd like to see the option to plant those replacement trees removed, because once again, it's a similar situation of where you don't know whether they've been planted, there's no requirement to continue to maintain them. We'd like to realistically see the value of the payment made to local councils, which is where it currently goes into some of the funds there, to really sort of get close to matching the value of that tree. There is currently a number of different methodologies for being able to work out how to value a tree. There's Burnley, there's a revised Burnley, there's the Melbourne tree method and all of that sort of stuff. One of the issues around those methodologies though currently is it's very difficult to get them to stand up in court, because you can have an arborist, they'll come out, they'll use the same methodology and they'll all arrive at a slightly different but similar conclusion. So legally that makes it quite difficult to enforce. There is, however, an Australian standard which the Arboricultural Society of Australia are currently trying to roll out, and that's in the very early stages of implementation, and we think that's a viable option sort of proceeding from here onwards forwards. Finally, and this is quite important because you don't want trees to become a burden on people who have them on their private land. If the tree is dying, that's been perfectly assessed by an arborist, it's dangerous, unhealthy, etc., then those fees should be essentially waived as part of the current systems.
If a developer were to remove a tree without permission, what fines apply?
Yeah, so you can find that the fines are up to $120,000, which is half decent. The issue there, though, actually is getting the prosecution for it. So those go through to the ERD court here in South Australia, and so you need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the tree itself has been illegally removed. So back to the pruning slides there originally, those pictures were from a court case which happened down in Unley, okay? Now, the City of Unley took a particular arborist and the homeowner to court over pruning those trees by more than 30%. The sticking point was the fact that the City of Unley couldn't prove definitively 4 minutes essentially before those trees were pruned what they looked like, and therefore you couldn't prove that more than 30% of those trees had been taken out. Under the new planning code, you can now sign up to something called civil penalties and enforcements. So instead of having to run through the court process behind it, councils can now essentially hand on-the-spot fines out to people if that's what's required. The City of Mitcham has done that already in regards to the illegal removal of a regulated tree, and they got a $10,000 fine essentially handed to the person who had done it. That might not sound like a lot, but recently the City of Burnside actually ran through the ERD court over an illegal tree removal out of Burnside. The tree had been misidentified as a spotted gum, which meant that it could be removed. It was within 10 metres of a dwelling. It was not a spotted gum, and not only that, but the tree was also on their significant tree list. As a result of the court proceedings around that, the arborist was fined $8,100 roughly, and due to their early guilty plea, that got discounted by 30%, so they only had to pay $5,000. So by the time council's run through a court process and the associated lawyer costs around it, it really hasn't been worthwhile. It's not something we so much cover in this top 10 here, but the actual the prosecution and sort of being able to get that compliance around this is a really complex issue. And once again, it's done much better interstate, where they can actually get some pretty hefty fines over the legal removals of trees.
Okay, and our final recommendation is to ensure that trees actually stay on the block upright and breathing until everything is in place for building and so on to proceed. So the Glenside site is a really good example of this. So some 5 or so years ago, they took a whole lot of trees down. I think it was about 80 significant and regulated trees, and did nothing. They didn't even have plans for what they were going to do for that part of the development. As a result of that, Mark Parnell actually took a bill to Parliament, which for whatever reason didn't get through. But what he was wanting to achieve with that bill was to stop that happening. So trees remain on the block until you've got planning approval, building approval, everything, all your little ducks are in a row, and then they can come down. And that would mean that even in the worst case scenario, if the decision that is in place for that development allows for the removal of those trees, it would at least allow for the environmental benefits that those trees provide to be there and to be enjoyed by everyone during that period of time. Okay, that's us. We're getting a bit wind up, I think. Correct? Okay. Obviously, we've run out of time for question and answer because we've talked too much.
No, I think we've probably got time for one or two very quick questions.
Okay, and to that I would add that we are out the front, so come and have a chat with us and ask us questions if you don't get a chance to ask them. Yes?
Yeah, I'm speaking with a little bit of a background, knowing what happens with building and planning.
Yeah.
And you know that since about the 70s or 80s, the way of building a house is different. They used to build around trees.
Yes.
And
you're
now
right.
there's just this thing of raise the block, dump a whole lot of a pad soil there.
Yep.
And it just makes it really easy and cheap to
Yes.
put a building. So while people are still building like that, it's going to be quite hard to enforce keeping the trees.
Yes, it is.
Developers need.
It is tricky, and the other thing that has changed significantly is the size of the homes that we live in. The actual footprint on a block is enormous, and it's the same with renovations. You know, Tom was saying about Walkerville, for instance, where they're having all this canopy loss. Suddenly, you have a post World War II home in the block, and you've got quite a bit of garden around it, and then the size of that is doubled or tripled, and you've got nowhere for a tree. So we really need to educate people and start to turn around that thinking about what is important. And there's so much evidence that tells us that the trees are really important. As I mean, the point was taking out your tree just so that you can enjoy solar, because the tree will actually save you more money than what you're getting from your solar. Simple. Darren,
One more
you have a
question.
question?
What's your current understanding of the time frame for the planning minister to consult before any of these recommendations have the chance of coming in?
Yes, great question. Thank you.
The impression we got a couple of weeks ago was maybe 2 years of consulting before any change. Is that still the current time frame?
We're really hoping that it won't be. So we all have until the 16th of December to put in submissions. So that's going to be really important. The expert review panel is going to report back, they're saying early next year. So I expect that might be maybe May or June. They're talking about March, but they always seem to run a bit behind time. It is very frustrating, the speed at which this is happening, because it feels like we're fiddling while Rome burns, really. Pop all your submissions in, and then they read them, but, meanwhile, trees going down left, right and centre. A question was actually asked of the planning minister the other day about why he doesn't just put a moratorium on full stop, so you can't take any trees down until decisions have been made. And his response basically was, under the form of government that we have at this point in time, that's not possible. So, believe it or not, but we would be really happy to take your questions and talk further, because we're actually running a workshop here next Thursday to a BYO device, write a submission, build a bit of community, and you can join us on that by Zoom if you're in Grange, for instance, and don't want to come all the way back up the hill.
I have to say that I'm disappointed that Ariella Healthcott couldn't join us today, but I am absolutely not disappointed with the quality of the speakers we've had in her stead. Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you, Tom. You're an absolute pleasure to work with, and thank you for your presentation.